I just finished up 2 custom media storage shelves for a friend. They were made to hold a large collection of DVDs, Blu-rays, video games, and even a few VHS tapes. They were made to fit inside 2 alcoves, one on each side of a screen in a home theater. For most of the construction, I used 3/4-inch walnut veneered plywood. For these 2 shelves, I ended up using about 1.5 full sheets. I started by breaking the plywood down into pieces close to their final dimensions. This piece is going to become both vertical sides of one shelf. Right here I'm laying out the center lines of the dados that will hold the shelves. I set up my router guide so that the center line of the router was exactly 2.5 inches from the edge of my track. As long as I positioned the track where I needed it, the dado would be perfectly aligned. I like cutting the dados this way before separating the 2 sides of the shelf. It saves on setup time and ensures both sides match perfectly. With the dados finished, I cut the vertical sides to their final dimensions. After that, I cut out the top and bottom pieces. Once the outside pieces were cut, it was time for the shelves. The front edges of the shelves and the face frames are all solid walnut. This pile is way more than this project needed, but it'll be used on a future job. Because I don't have a long bed joiner, I had to straight line with a track saw. The table saw took care of the final edge. I ripped off some thin strips for the shelf faces. These were then trimmed to length and glued onto the shelves. When the time came for the dado stack, I decided to install it via gratuitous stop motion. This only made it take about an hour longer than it needed to. These recesses that I'm cutting are going to be for the LED strip lights. I masked and painted these grooves black so that the sharp contrast between the interior of the plywood core and the walnut veneer wouldn't be visible. Next, I added the rabbet to the outside pieces of the shelf where the back panel will eventually be installed. To accommodate the wiring and keep it hidden, I cut grooves on one side of each shelf. I very carefully trimmed and fitted some extra plywood to ensure that the wiring would stay hidden and that the veneer on the outside would match. This worked better than I'd hoped. Next, I cut the hole for the switch. There are a lot of different ways I could have held the 4 corners of this shelf together. I could have used pocket screws, I could have cut a rabbet, but I decided to use dominoes. Everything was very carefully sanded before final glue up. This plywood was not inexpensive, and sanding through walnut veneer would appear very obvious after finishing. With the sanding finished, glue was applied, dominoes were inserted, and the entire shelf was put together in one go. The face frames are pretty simple, just 4 pieces of hardwood per shelf. I could have gone with pocket screws or half-lap joints, but I decided to use dominoes. This really is the fastest and cleanest way of doing it. I routed a profile on the top and bottom pieces of the face frame before assembling it. I get this question a lot, so I'm going to answer it now. These are Wolfcraft corner clamps and you can get them on Amazon. Because these shelves are going in alcoves, there's really no reason I couldn't have used pocket screws to attach the face frames, because after all, nothing on the sides would have been visible. But what if these shelves weren't going to fit into alcoves? What if the sides were going to be visible? In that case, I would attach the face frame with dominoes like this. But let's say you wanted to do this and you didn't want to spend the money on a domino joiner. This is a place where a regular old biscuit joiner would work great. I sanded the interior edge before install. I did it at this point because this is flush mounted and I wanted to minimize any chance that I had to sand through veneer. Then the face frames were glued on. At this point, final sanding on the front of the face frame could happen. For finishing, I used Rubio Monocoat with a walnut tint. Yes, this stuff is expensive, but given how much time it saves, how good it looks when it's done, and how easy it is to apply, the expense is well worth it. Wiring 12-volt LED strips is pretty basic. The biggest thing you want to watch out for are shorts. My first step was installing the switch. The LEDs I got came with this dimmer switch, which was not going to be practical. However, I did need the female end. I stripped this down to the copper and then spliced on a length of 20 gauge wire. I fed the wire through heat shrink tubing before soldering the connections. This lead is what the 12-volt power supply will be connected to. The other end of that lead was then attached to the input wires on my switch. I used a few dabs of hot glue to secure this wire into the channel. I secured the end of the wire where it comes out of the bottom of the shelf with a little piece I 3D printed. At this point I thought it would be a good idea to test it out and make sure all the connections thus far worked. The dados for the lighting on each shelf overlap the groove for the wiring on the vertical side. This leaves a small hole for the wires to go through cleanly. As it turns out, I did forget to leave a provision for the lower light. This was easily remedied. Next, I built up some basic wiring harnesses to connect all the LED strips in parallel. The idea is that a pair of red and black wires will enter and a pair of red and black wires will leave each LED strip light connector. The pair of wires that leave the LED connector will move on to the next one, thus continuing the chain. Next, I fed the bare wire ends into the lighting grooves. For these shelves, I used a screw-type LED connector. I have to say I really like them. They provided a really solid connection and were easy to use. One thing to be mindful of with any type of 2-wire LED strip light is you can't cross the poles. With all the LED connectors installed, I soldered the lighting harnesses to the switch. These connections were also covered in heat shrink. The lead for the top light was secured in a method similar to the lower one. The printing is small, but each LED strip shows where the positive and negative wires go. If you cross the wires, the LEDs will not illuminate. Once the connector contact screws are tightened down, I can remove the adhesive strip and glue down the connector itself. I'm not entirely trustworthy of self-adhesive strips, so I 3D printed these little clips. They go in with a little dab of hot glue and also quite a bit of friction. 3 per shelf, make sure the strip doesn't fall down. And finally, once all the wiring was done, I was able to install the wire cover piece. At this point, I was able to sand and finish the last side. This was not maybe the most elegant solution to the problem, but because my switch was so thick, I had to make this little plate to cover it up. I could have avoided doing this a few different ways. One would be to get a thinner switch, 2, make the side of the shelf much thicker, or 3, put a bump out on the other side to create the space I needed. Because ultimately this will never be visible once the shelf is installed in the alcove, this seemed like a good enough solution. The back panels were made out of 1/4-inch plywood and covered in imitation leather. This was glued down with a combination of contact cement and spray adhesive. The back panels were screwed into each shelf. I secured the top and bottom edges with a few box nails. 2 French cleats were added to be able to hang the shelf to a wall. I made a corresponding bracket which could be directly screwed into the wall studs, and then the entire media shelf could be hung from that. Here you can see that bracket attached to the wall, and both shelves installed on either side of the screen. I'm really happy with how both these shelves came out, and I hope you enjoyed watching the process of building them.